Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, as that repeated mission statement indicates, we here at Good Faith believe there's this intimate connection between following Jesus and making sense of the world. And many of our episodes draw the connection from our life of following Jesus to something out there happening in the world. We're asking, given that we are Jesus followers, how should we think and act vis-a-vis some world event? But we also believe that the other direction is important. How does the world and what's happening in the world affect and shape our life of following Jesus? In other words, I believe world events out there, even difficult, sometimes traumatic world events out there, can actually helpfully prompt our spiritual growth, our intimacy with Jesus. And in particular, I've been thinking about this year because this year and this sort of season in the world, it seems like, is often filled with traumatic events. And we're obviously heading right into one in the United States with a presidential election that, frankly, many people in the world view with a great deal of trepidation and some fear of trauma. And so I wanted to ask the question, can this event and other events like it actually be an opportunity for personal spiritual growth as followers of Jesus? And to address this question, I'm so glad that we have our guest today, the Reverend Summer Joy Gross. Summer, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Curtis, it is such a privilege to be with you. I love the deep conversations that you are inviting us into. It's such a gift for the church. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And you're a perfect guest for this because your life's work is about helping people grow closer to Jesus. And you do this in so many different sort of capacities. I thought if you could just take the opportunity to introduce the different things that you do that you think the audience would be helpful to know about your background.
Yeah, I am a spiritual director. I'm an Anglican priest of 20 years. And so I've had 10 years of parish experience. And now I just love the privilege of small groups and of kind of getting into the nitty gritty of people's stories. It's such a privilege to walk through difficult circumstances with them and find where God is at work, because he's always at work.
Well, this is the theme of your book, the Emmanuel Promise, Discovering the Security of a Life Held by God. And I knew when I read this book, I wanted to bring you in to talk about how do we use this season of the world where there's so many things happen in the world that can seem like problems, that can seem like things that we just are trying to get through, actually as an opportunity, as a doorway to spiritual growth. And in the beginning of your book, you quote C.S. Lewis. I thought it was a wonderful quote. I'm going to read it. It says, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with him. He walks everywhere incognito. And the incognito is not always hard to penetrate. The real labor is to attend. In fact, to come awake. Still more, to remain awake." So, Summer, your book talks about that a lot in terms of events in people's lives that could be described as trauma. I mean, that is described as trauma of varying sizes and shapes. Say more about why you think what our experiences in the world, including traumatic experiences in the world, why that's actually something like the C.S. Lewis quote says, something for us actually to remain awake to as a way to actually grow closer to God.
It's always helpful, like as a spiritual director, I'm always inviting people to pay attention. Pay attention on what's going on inside as you listen to world events, as something kind of rocks you. And so you pay attention. And then one of the most helpful things that I can say is to invite Jesus into it right away and say, God, where are you with us right now?
Mm-hmm.
The Lord said at the burning bush, he said, I'm concerned about their suffering. I'm hearing your cries. I'm seeing you. So I think we can always know that whatever we're going through, God is seeing us. And so we ask that question, what are you seeing with us right now? I just invite everyone to ask God a lot of questions.
Mm.
I think we tend to ask God questions that are super cerebral, but we forget to bring him into our day-to-day life.
I love that, Summer. I mean, I think our posture to the world can be, I need to understand the world. And so I ask questions kind of with the rational part of your brain. But it seems like you're saying we also need to ask questions with the other part of our brain, or the other part of our heart, if you will, about what is this doing to us inside? What's happening inside, not just what's happening out there in the world. And I think your book gives us some tools. So let's unpack some of the tools that you give to help make sense of how to look inside as we are responding to what's happening in the world. You actually bring in, very interestingly, sort of a whole paradigm of how people are formed internally, called attachment theory. So unpack that for us. Why is this way of thinking about self and the inner life, attachment theory, why might that be helpful for us to make sense of how the world is shaping us and forming us?
Yeah, so I'm not the first one to come up with this at all. In fact, this is what Dallas Willard was working on right before he passed away. This is actually his last conference that he gave was
Mm.
around this topic on attachment theory and spiritual formation going together. So essentially, if people aren't familiar with attachment theory, it's just that in the first 3 years of our life, the experience that we have with our caregiver helps to create the neural pathways that we have for every other relationship going forward. So it's literally the brain map that we have for everything going forward, for our relationship with our spouse,
Mm.
for our relationship with other important folks, but also in our relationship with God. So I have a lot of people coming to me with shame, experiencing the fact that someone in the pulpit is talking about intimacy with God or a relationship with God. And that relationship is just not happening for them.
Mm.
They maybe have a lot of good information and they've downgraded their expectations over time from, I'm going to have a relationship or a love affair really with God um, or a friendship, all of these relational words. And there's so many folks that downgrade their experience after being so focused on discipleship, which is so essential. So essential. But when we focus so much on information, sometimes we lack that relational connection. And so people start to believe that it's not a possibility this side of
Mhm.
heaven.
Yeah. So talk about the different ways in which this can deform us, if you will, in terms of our ability to interact with the world. Like what's happening inside us in terms of the life formation that we had at a very early stage. What would be some examples?
That's such a great question. I love your word of deform or malform, and each one of us have it some level anyway. So there's no shame in this. There's a couple different attachment styles, and one is secure. That a
Mm.
child knows that when they are struggling in some way, when they are hurt, when they need comfort, when they need some type of physical need met, that they can go to their caregiver and their caregiver is happy to turn around and care for them. And attachment, secure attachment is formed in those thousands of interactions with a caregiver. So we can see that secure attachment on a playground if you've ever spent time with a child on the playground, in which they're playing and they're sliding down slides, and they keep looking back towards that caregiver, wondering, are you watching? Are you delighting in me? Are you there if I need me? So you see that secure attachment. There are some that fear abandonment, and even fear abandonment by God, but they fear abandonment, and so they'll kind of cling close. They'll
Mhm.
stay as close as possible to that caregiver, and they always wonder if they have to tune into the caregiver in order to make sure that their needs are met. Does that make sense? I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting for those of us who are natural people pleasers like
Yeah.
myself, that kind of tuning in to someone else's world in order to try to get our needs met. We're not actually tuning in order to care for them.
Yeah.
We're tuning in to make sure we're okay. So that's a form of insecure, anxious
Yeah.
attachment. And then in insecure, avoidant attachment, there you can see a child who doesn't look back at the parent, who is so independent that they'll kind of avoid the parent because they don't even know if the parent is paying attention to them
Right.
or the parent is available or attuned to their inner world. So that phrase is really important. Having someone tuned in to their inner world. And so they'll kind of lose hope and they'll start to avoid that
Mm.
caregiver. And so that's where insecure avoidant attachment comes from.
Yeah.
So we've got those three, and there's one more, and that one's really based on trauma. That's disorganized attachment.
Yeah.
And that's the precious, precious people who experience trauma from their caregiver or watch their caregiver hurt or harm someone else. And so trust was just completely broken down at
Right.
that point. And so they have that disorganized. They're like, you have the food I need. So there's kind of an inching forward, but then a fear that you don't know how you're going to be able to get care at that point. So, anyways, that's the disorganized.
So you've got these, and I imagine these are all happening on a spectrum, but you've got these sort of four types: insecure, anxious, insecure, avoidant, insecure, disorganized, and then secure. And I imagine, as with so many of these categories, you don't want to get completely labeled as one, but they seem to be helpful categories just to help us make sense of what's happening in our inner world. And if I understand you correctly, what attachment theory says is, look, our brain has been wired in a particular way because of early experiences, and especially in our family of origin, and our brain is kind of wired that way. And so we're going to take that out into the world. So even as a child, we're going to take that out into the playground. And so I was thinking about myself, and I was like, well, I think there's ways in which I would probably call myself as insecure anxious. I've written a book on anxiety for very good reason. And I can trace that to some family of origin issues. People who've read my book can kind of recognize some of the stories I tell about my early childhood experiences as a latchkey kid that made me insecure, anxious in that way.
Yeah.
And I can see how that shaped how I went out into the world. And so let's keep going out further and further beyond the playground into the broader world, because it seems to me then, if that is the brain map that we bring, we are one of these, four categories or a mix of those perhaps, that's going to really influence how we are being shaped by world events. And I think about myself as an insecure, anxious person, that I need more information. I cling to the world's sources of information because I sort of need more from the world to feel more, to try to feel more secure about it. And so I'm always gobbling up what's happening here, what's happening there. sounds like an insecure, avoidant person would be like, I don't want to hear about any of it. I want to actually avoid the world or withdraw from the world or something like that.
Yeah, and that's not quite it. People
Okay.
who are avoidant people who are insecure, anxious may do a lot of ruminating on world events,
Okay.
in that feeling of not feeling secure. And maybe I can just figure it out enough to fix it.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the insecure anxious. The insecure avoidant will sometimes use world events and news sources and just kind of throw themselves into it in order to avoid their own inner world.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So they're using it almost as a way to actually distract from what's happening inside.
Yes. In fact, they might even tell themselves, this is more important out there
Hmm.
than what's going on vulnerably within me.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to stay connected to the emotions that happen through the world events. I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday, how she numbs her inner life in order by the news, by spending time in just kind of looking for one news service after another to tell her the same thing so she can stay in a state of anger or frustration or something like that. But it keeps her it's kind of a form of armor at that point.
Farmer distraction, addiction almost to kind of keep us away from that inner life. And then it sounds like disorganized is this where you're just overwhelmed. You feel like you don't actually have some almost strategy. You're just feeling kind of swamped by it. How then, if secure is really, it seems like where we want to be in our inner life, especially secure with God. How does this happen when we are swamped by all these different kinds of reactions to the world event, either an anxious wrestling with the world, a addiction to the world to distract us, or just overwhelmed by the world? How map for us a path of spiritual growth when people are feeling like the world events are causing all of these reactions, are hooking into kind of these attachment disorders within us?
I just love this idea and this questioning. I just think this is so helpful. So, what we see from David in the Psalms is that he does a really good job bringing what's on the inside straight up to God in God's presence. The Psalms are our prayer manual, really. And he goes straight from major emotions, from jealousy to rage to suicidality. Just whatever's going on within him, he brings it straight up to God. And then he asks the question, almost always. There's one or two Psalms where he doesn't, but he almost always asks the question about how can it change my perception of this when I look at God's character? And so when we bring our emotion, we allow ourselves to be honest before God, then we have that moment where we kind of sit in silence and we say, but remind me who you are, God. Remind me that you are on the throne. Remind me that you have done these things in the past, that you are a faithful God. Anyway, so that's the framework of prayer that we've been taught by David that we can use in this world event space as well, as we get overwhelmed by concern for our future, concern for our country's future, concern for what we're seeing in Israel, that type of thing. Then I just invite everyone to spend time bringing that up before the Lord and knowing that God is attuning to us, that He cares about our daily things, He cares about the big things. And He wants to attune to us in that place and help to regulate us, bringing truth and His kindness and tenderness and compassion to those feelings.
Summer, it sounds like, in a sense, we're getting reparented by God, and these sort of responses to kind of traumatic world events are almost an opportunity to get reparented in a way that maybe didn't happen as healthily as it should have in little trauma events in our little world as 3-year-olds or something like that, right? Like, so if we didn't get the proper attunement from our parents, let's say, when, I don't know, we got bullied at school or something like that.
Exactly.
When we face a big bully in the world stage now that creates that same sense of fear and trauma, this is an opportunity to kind of get reparented by God so that we experience a heavenly parent that is tuning in, that is helping us regulate our emotions. Is that a way to think about that?
I love it. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
The truth is that attachment with God is built one cry and response at a time.
Yeah.
So if we try to hold it in and we allow it to get huge, kind of balloon within us, and only bring it to God when it feels opportune or when we're at church or at specific times, then maybe at that time it's too big. But to allow ourselves to connect each day, each couple days to what's going on the inside and allow God to tune in with us so that every cry can experience his kindness, his tenderness, his care.
So it seems like it's important for us to be really clear about and just try to be descriptive about this attunement process that God does that is so manifested in Jesus, as you described, and how Jesus relates to Israel in his ministry. Because it strikes me that there's a strong Christian tradition that mistakes attunement for override, and those are two different things that strikes me. Because I when I think about my own experience as a child and being parented and how maybe, attunement didn't happen in the optimal fashion, I think a lot of what happened was override. So like, as children, and this is very classic of Asian immigrant families, you would experience some little trauma, something that upset you in your world, in your little world. And generally, I would say my parents' response was, "You shouldn't feel that way. Why are you so worried? Why are you so upset? Don't cry. Don't be upset." Like it was actually an override, not an attunement. And I think I've sort of, my spiritual growth has been to actually bring that into God, my own relationship with God in the present, and to make the distinction between override and attunement, because it can be, you can sort of make a mistake to think, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now. I shouldn't feel anxious. Like God's telling me, almost, again, I'm replaying my, parental experience, right? Of like God saying, almost wagging his finger at me, "You shouldn't feel this way. Don't feel this way. Why are you feeling this way? There's so many things you should be grateful for." And so that's not actually attunement, because it's not starting with and tuning into my actual existing anxiety and then like gently leading us out of that. It's sort of skipping right ahead to it's an overrealized kind of eschatology, if you will. It's an overrealized solution. So can you describe that a little more? Because I think there are people out there who, when they hear you talk about this, like God leading us out of our state of anxiety, it can sound like, or it can evoke that override feeling like, oh, I'm just not supposed to feel this way. So let me quickly get there. God wants me to immediately get there to that place of not being anxious.
J.I. Packer was one of our favorite Anglicans and helped us out, but he's a real Reformed thinker as well. He helped us create our beautiful catechism that's called To Be a Christian. It's so interesting because I think because Anglicanism is so broad. We call ourselves a three streams church. So we've got the charismatic, we've got the sacramental, and we've got the evangelical, more reformed side, high scripture, focus on scripture, that I think it depends on the church, to tell you the truth, what that override is going to be. But I do agree with you. And let's look at scripture for just a second around that, because I think Jesus does something really interesting in the raising of Lazarus. So he's waited 4 days, and Lazarus is fully dead. He's in the tomb. There's no hope left in the sister's mind. And Mary comes and she's weeping and beside herself. And she said, if you had been here, this would not have happened. And instead of overriding her at that moment and saying, just wait, I'm going to do something really spectacular in a moment. And he already knows because he told the disciples that earlier. He said, don't worry, this is all to happen for the Lord's glory. But he doesn't say that to Mary at that moment. What he does is he weeps. He weeps, he joins her in the pain of the world, and he doesn't override her. So I think that's a good illustration of God attuning to us, even though he knows that he's going to be on his throne at the end, that he still wants to join us in our pain. And we don't see David overriding himself either in the Psalms. He's very clear about all the emotions that he's carrying. So I just think it's really interesting to see Jesus sitting with so much compassion around people. He says the Greek word for the compassion that Jesus has is that it comes from the belly, almost like a labor pain, that he has so much compassion for his people. So I believe, and he's tuned in, like he's even tuned into their hunger on a day that he is in so much grief because John the Baptist has passed away and he's trying to get away in order to have some time by himself to be with the Father. And instead, the people come and they're hungry and he's tuned in. He said, okay, let's take care of them.
Summer, I think anybody listening to this, like, well, that sounds wonderful to have, to experience the Jesus that weeps for the world. And as I am weeping, or as I am angry, or as I'm fearful, I want to draw close to Jesus as the world is making me feel this way. Summer, let's get practical. How can people grow in this way? What are some practical steps people can take in this season?
Well, Curtis, as you know, I love the practical. I get so tired of the shame heaped on people that they should understand how to do this by themselves. But I just invite people to use a couple different things. One is a safe and loving friend to tell what's going on within them. And I think we have some good space for that in our Protestant world, that we're good at kind of holding each other's stories and leading each other to Jesus in prayer. So that can be a wonderful gift of attunement, right? Through the hands and feet of another person. Using journaling, I think, is one of the most helpful ways as well of writing out, like David did, writing out a lament and spending time getting specific about what's happening in our inner world and bringing it up before God. And then there's a third process created by Sungshim Lapnow is her name. She's a marriage and family therapist, and she took that beautiful verse at the burning bush, in which God said, I see their suffering, I hear them. And she kind of tore apart that verse and gives us time to listen to how God feels about us in our present world. And so she called that Emmanuel journaling. And I have information about this, but Sungshim has a book with Jim Wilder called The Joyful Journey that really does a beautiful job of walking people through this.
Summer, in all the practical steps, which all of them sound really wonderful, the common theme there is the need for time to actually set apart and take time to do these things. And it has struck me about how difficult it is for modern Westerns to carve out that time, not actually because they lack that time, but because there's so many things that distract them from taking time to do the deep inner work that you're talking about. And I want to actually name a time that I think this challenge happens for many modern Westerners. And I'm going to pick a somewhat arbitrary time, but let's call it 8 p.m. And that time is the time, let's say if you are a parent of young children, your children have been put to bed, you've done all that work, and you finally take a sigh and like, okay, I have got, I don't know, 2 hours ahead of me. Or you've done the dishes, you've done the chores, whatever, you've gotten your work done, you're finally set. And there's just this moment where I feel like what many people experience, they describe symptomatically as I'm feeling bored. Because I don't have anything to do now. Like my tasks of the day are done. So it presents as boredom, but sort of following the great thinker, philosopher Charles Taylor, he describes boredom as actually sort of the masking symptom of meaninglessness. That's actually what boredom is. It's just we cannot actually face the yawning existential gasp that we may be struggling with some sense of meaninglessness or aloneness in the world. And so we experience it as boredom because then we think the answer is, well, then let me entertain myself or distract myself in some way. And this is where, again, if you are in that particular personality profile that tends towards distraction, this is when you pick up the Netflix. This is when you pick up the streaming service and you're just scrolling through a catalog full of, mostly not very satisfying or deep things. And just, sometimes you'll spend an hour just scrolling through it, not even watching something, or you watch something and you're at the end, you're like, well, that was kind of the spiritual equivalent of eating junk food or something like that. Or if you're the, heading towards anxious type, that's when you pick up your social media and your news and you want to like, what's happening in the world? I got to master it. But it's that moment where in response to this sense of boredom, we go to these other distractive, oftentimes numbing or addictive methods of entertainment. What in that moment, speak to us as a spiritual director, as a pastor, as somebody who's trying to cultivate the inner life. What do we do then? Summer, help us get really super practical at that 8 p.m. moment, at that moment in time. How do we make the turn towards a deeper life with Jesus versus a shallower distraction of Netflix?
I just want to say I have so much compassion for that moment because I get so exhausted at the end of the day. There's two things that help me. One is to I know this sounds interesting, but to kind of build a tray. I know this sounds funny, but to put things on it that will lead me to a more deeper life during the day so that I'm building anticipation. There's actually neuroscience behind this. So I'm building anticipation through the day, and that creates an easier kind of speed bump to that moment. Like if I'm putting things on my bedside table and maybe I'm putting, I don't know, some San Pellegrino on there as well. And I'm just thinking about a moment of joy and delight at the same time that I have a book that I want to read or that I want to do a spiritual practice or something like that. So that for me really helps if I'm thinking about it in visually and tangibly, creating a space where I'm collecting those things so that I'm seeing them all day long. That really helps me. Second is just pushing play on something so that someone else is leading me through. Again, I want this speed bump to be as small as possible. So if I can just push play and hear someone else read scripture over me and lead me into the presence of Jesus, or lead me into an Emmanuel journaling session or something like that, that really helps me if I know, if as long as I push play, they're going to be doing the hard work.
Yeah. It seems like we need, I love those those habit building kind of practices, building anticipation. I love that idea of building a tray. So it sounds like these are objects that kind of connote pleasure, connote enjoyment, and that they're pointing you, hey, there's a time coming when you can actually go deeper with God. And also, it sounds like being led by others, so that you're not having to generate all of the energy, all of the effort. It also seems to me like just it's trying to start really small. Is also very helpful. So it's not like, okay, this evening I'm going to read Karl Barth's Dogmatics or something like that. So it's like, no, how about 15 minutes? Start with something that you can do for 15 minutes. I know for myself, listeners have heard me talk about this, but I think my spiritual life took a just sort of dramatic turn forward in just a very small decision that I just resolved on that evening when that 8 p.m. moment for me. For me, the temptation was actually to go surf to find more consumer research, to do consumer research on something like that. I knew that was the thing. That was my drug of choice. And just say, look, when I feel that way, I'm just going to take 15 minutes of silence. And that's it. I'm just going to be silent. And that 15 minutes became 30 and an hour and longer times of contemplative prayer. But that took years for that to happen. But it began with a decision just to take a different path with a first small step that was doable, concrete, So
I love
think
that. And I'm going to add one more that I think
Go
can
for
be
it.
really helpful. I call it the 10 minutes of stillness. And I love giving my phone a job. So if I push, 10 minutes on my phone so that I'm doing something, and then I go outside and I listen to the birds and I just open up that sense for a minute.
Yeah.
And then I begin to look at something highly detailed out my window for a minute. And in just 10 minutes, it can change the amount of cortisol in my body, the amount of focus that I have for this next step going forward, etc. So that 10 minutes of stillness I find really helpful.
So, listeners, let's together as community try to experiment and adopt with some of these spiritual practices. In this season, when the latest poll results sends your heart a fluttering, or the latest news headline you see about something happening in the world out there that sparks tragedy and trauma and suffering in the world, let's try to actually use that as an opportunity to let God attune us to bring those feelings in with God. And maybe that really does mean like, okay, I know I'm feeling this way. I'm going to just reserve at 8 p.m., I'm going to take 15 minutes to let God, through these various practices that Summers described, tune into me with those feelings and see where God leads us in that. Because I really do believe our experience of the world's trauma can really be that opportunity for God to reparent us into more secure people. So I wanted to talk about actually being as a parent, because if we have experienced ways in which, less than ideal parenting might have caused some sort of insecurity, lack of full attachment, I think as parents we're like, well, I don't want to do that to my kids. I want I want my kids to grow up to be secure. Talk to us about that. How, as parents, can we help our kids experience the world in ways that lead them towards greater security? And that could be the world's events that are happening on their playground. But also, I think, our kids are increasingly exposed to what's happening in the broader world, to my daughter, I think, experienced real trauma as an adolescent, because one evening she happened to watch, around the time that this happened, the George Floyd video. Like it happened to pop into her feed, and that was like a traumatic event, right? So our kids are experiencing little trauma on the playground, trauma in the world. How, as parents, do we parent them in a way that leads them to become people who are capable of secure attachments especially secure attachments to God?
There is a practice that Ignatius gave us called the examen that can be super simple. It can be longer, it can be 15, 20 minutes, or it can be really simple. And there's a book by Jim Manney, Manney, that's the simple life-giving question. It's just 100 pages long, really short, but he talks about this particular practice of asking a few questions of where did I find the life of God today?
Yeah.
And where was the life of God hindered in me today? And just asking, holding those two questions. There are other questions. What was heavy? What was light? Something like that. So that examen in which you can push play, pray as you go, has some great examens, and that is super helpful for me when I'm tired at night. I almost think that nighttime is a good time to do some inner cleaning work. So that I can be ready and fresh for the next day. Because if I don't process my stuff during that 8 o'clock time period, I will practice it and process it all night long. My brain will be doing that work as I sleep, and I'll be struggling, and I'll wake up more frustrated than I was when at my 8 o'clock time period. So having a moment where we do that kind of inner cleaning time with the examen, or maybe with another practice at prayer time with God, can be a way of getting free so that we can go to bed ready to ruminate on something different, ruminate on the good, ruminate on our gratitude, ruminate on how God is breaking in our daily life.
Summer, a lot of these, and I think the most powerful ones are ones that we can practice by ourselves in a regular discipline, regular practice. But I also want to talk about special interventions, if you want to call it, special helps. And one of them is spiritual direction. You are a spiritual director. I think this is a resource that some Christians are familiar with. Many are not. And so could you please introduce more about spiritual direction, and when can it be something that somebody should consider for themselves?
So spiritual direction, I feel like the name is unhelpful.
Okay.
I feel like I use the name, it's the classic name, but really what we're doing is we are coming alongside someone on their journey, like Jesus did in the walk to Emmaus. He listened to their story. He let them tell all about the day's events, the week's events, what had happened. He let them pour it all out, and even heard them say this line, "We had hoped." So he gave them time in which to name the great pain that they were sitting with. And then he walked with them. And then he led them into his presence, of course, into his truth. And then he broke bread and invited them into his presence. So spiritual direction is really a walking alongside. It's a listening. It's letting people name things. And then it's creating enough space for silence in which people are doing their own inner work, but we're creating the capacity for it. We're creating the container for that inner work. And it's such a privilege. I can't even tell you what an honor it is to have people bring their true self, their full self into the room, knowing that there's no judgment, there's no shame. It's a privilege to walk with people, whatever their background story is. And then at that point, to lead us into the presence of Jesus and allow, say, a piece of scripture to speak to us at that moment. So it's not discipleship.
And say more about how somebody, if as they're hearing you describe this, like, wow, something is resonating, something is beating a little fast, like, I think I could be helped by that. How would they get started finding a spiritual director?
It's such a good question. And I can send you guys a link. The Grafted In community, and I think they're still called the Evangelical Spiritual Directors Association, has done a really good job kind of gathering a lot of folks who are theologically strong and theologically, as I would say, orthodox, and who still do this work, because there are spiritual directors who are from other traditions. And so it's important to find a spiritual director from your tradition.
That's great. Well, yes, we'll put those links up on our show notes. And Summer, thank you so much for this great conversation. You've been a great spiritual accompaniment to us on this. So thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure to talk with you about this.
Thank you, Curtis. It's been such a privilege. Thank you.
Well, listeners of the Good Faith Podcast, let's really take the encouragement and advice of Summer to heart. Let's use this season where the world wants to press in on us in so many ways with traumatic events happening in the world, or the world wants to press in on us with so many diversionary, distracting options. Let's instead tune into God, the God revealed in Jesus that wants to tune in to us. And so let's do that. And please tell me how that's working out for you. Give me feedback. You can send me an email at info@redeemingbabel.org and leave a review for us. That's super helpful for us to hear how listeners are responding to us through our reviews. So please do that wherever you get this podcast. And next week, once again, we will gather around the campfire.